The shell screamed across 15 miles of desert wasteland, its trajectory calculated to perfection by hands they said were too small to handle real artillery. When it struck dead center of the target, silence fell across the observation deck like a heavy curtain. Then came the sound every doubter dreaded most, the slow, deliberate clap of the commanding officer, who had bet his career she would fail. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Meridian's artillery range as Maria Santos adjusted the strap of her equipment bag and tried to ignore the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 5 feet 4 inches and barely 120 pounds, she looked nothing like the towering figures who dominated the artillery corps. Her slight frame seemed almost fragile against the massive backdrop of howitzers and field cannons that stretched across the training grounds like sleeping giants waiting to be awakened. The whispers weren't new. They had started the moment she'd walked through the gates of Fort Meridian 6 months ago, fresh out of advanced ballistics training, with scores that had made her instructors do double takes. Numbers didn't lie, but apparently neither did appearances, and Maria's appearance told a story that most people thought they already knew. Small woman, big guns, inevitable failure. The equation seemed simple enough to everyone, except Maria herself. She had grown up in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in New Mexico, where her grandfather had taught her that mathematics was the universal language and precision was the only currency that mattered. While other children played video games, Maria spent afternoons in her grandfather's workshop, learning to calculate trajectory angles and wind compensation with the same dedication other kids applied to memorizing baseball statistics. Her grandfather had been an artillery specialist in Korea, a man whose weathered hands could adjust firing solutions with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. The old man never spoke much about the war, but he spoke endlessly about the beauty of ballistics. He taught Maria that every shot was a conversation between physics and instinct, between the cold certainty of mathematics and the warm unpredictability of human judgment. He showed her how to read wind patterns in the movement of grass, how to account for temperature variations that could throw a shell hundreds of yards off target, and how to trust calculations even when every instinct screamed that they were wrong. When her grandfather passed away during her senior year of high school, Maria found his old artillery manuals hidden in a trunk beneath his workbench. The pages were yellowed with age and filled with handwritten notes in the margins, corrections and refinements that spoke of decades spent perfecting an already precise science. She read every page twice, then began working through the problems herself, using software simulations to test theories her grandfather had developed 50 years earlier. Her math teacher, Mrs. Chen, noticed Maria's sudden fascination with trajectory calculations and encouraged her to enter a statewide physics competition. Maria's project on long-range ballistic accuracy won first place and earned her a full scholarship to study mechanical engineering at New Mexico State. She accepted the scholarship but chose a different path, one that led her to an Army recruiter's office and eventually to artillery school. The decision had surprised everyone who knew her. Maria was quiet, studious, the kind of person who solved problems with patience rather than force. She seemed better suited for a laboratory than a battlefield, more comfortable with equations than explosions. But something in her grandfather's notes had called to her, a sense of unfinished business that she couldn't quite explain even to herself. Artillery school had been brutal in ways that had nothing to do with the physical demands. Maria could handle the weight of the shells, could endure the long hours and the exhausting training exercises. What she struggled with was the constant assumption that she didn't belong. Instructors spoke to her more slowly, as if she might not understand concepts that she had mastered years earlier. Fellow trainees offered to help with calculations that she could solve faster than they could set up their equipment. The condescension was wrapped in kindness, which somehow made it worse. Nobody was overtly hostile. They were just protective, the way people are protective of children who wander into adult spaces. Maria learned to smile and nod, and prove herself over and over again, demonstrating competence that should have been obvious but somehow never quite stuck in people's memories. Her scores were consistently the highest in her class. Her theoretical knowledge was unmatched. Her practical applications were flawless. Yet when assignment time came, She was placed at Fort Meridian under the command of Colonel James Harrison, a man whose reputation for breaking difficult soldiers was matched only by his skepticism about women in combat roles. Harrison had made his position clear during their first meeting. He sat behind a desk covered with commendations and photographs from 3 combat deployments, his gray eyes studying Maria with the detached interest of a scientist examining a particularly puzzling specimen. He spoke in measured tones about the importance of unit cohesion and the challenges faced by soldiers who didn't fit traditional molds. He never explicitly said that he thought she would fail, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Maria's assignment was to the 155mm Howitzer crew, led by Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a career soldier whose 20-year service record was decorated with efficiency ratings and combat commendations. Thompson was professional but distant, the kind of leader who evaluated people based on their ability to contribute to the mission rather than their potential to complicate it. He assigned Maria to calculation and coordination duties, keeping her away from the physical operation of the guns themselves. The Howitzer crew consisted of 6 other soldiers, each with clearly defined roles that had been perfected through months of training together. Private Jake Morrison handled ammunition loading with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same motions thousands of times. Corporal Lisa Chang operated the elevation controls with an artist's touch for fine adjustments. Specialist David Park managed communications between the gun crew and forward observers, translating target coordinates into firing solutions with practiced efficiency. Then there was Sergeant First Class Robert Stone, the crew's most experienced gunner, whose unofficial job seemed to be testing every new addition to the team until they either proved themselves or requested transfer. Stone had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, had seen combat in conditions that most soldiers only read about in training manuals. His skepticism about Maria wasn't personal, it was professional, the kind of doubt that kept people alive in situations where mistakes had permanent consequences. Stone never directly challenged Maria's competence, but he watched her constantly, monitoring her calculations and double-checking her work with the thoroughness of someone who trusted nothing he couldn't verify personally. When she provided firing solutions, he would nod politely and then perform his own calculations, comparing results with the kind of careful attention that suggested he expected to find errors. The dynamic created an atmosphere of perpetual evaluation that exhausted Maria more than any physical training ever had. Every calculation became a test. Every suggestion, an opportunity to prove herself worthy of trust that seemed perpetually just out of reach. She began arriving at the range 30 minutes early each morning, using the extra time to review previous day's exercises and prepare for whatever challenges the training schedule might present. Fort Meridian's artillery range stretched across 12 square miles of New Mexico desert, a landscape that seemed designed to test both equipment and resolve. The terrain was unforgiving, filled with unexpected wind patterns and temperature variations that could turn routine training exercises into lessons in adaptation and improvisation. Mountains ringed the range on 3 sides, creating microclimates that shifted throughout the day and challenged even experienced crews to maintain accuracy across long distances. The range featured targets at distances from 500 meters to 18 miles, each designed to test different aspects of artillery operation. Close-range targets focused on rapid response and direct fire support. Medium-range targets emphasized precision and coordination between multiple gun crews. Long-range targets demanded mastery of advanced ballistics and the kind of mathematical precision that separated competent gunners from exceptional ones. Maria's first weeks at Fort Meridian followed a predictable pattern. She would arrive early, review weather conditions and wind patterns, and prepare preliminary calculations for the day's exercises. When the rest of the crew arrived, she would present her work to Sergeant Thompson, who would review it with Stone before approving the day's firing solutions. The actual operation of the howitzer remained the responsibility of the more experienced crew members, while Maria observed and learned the practical applications of theories she had studied for years. The arrangement frustrated her in ways she struggled to articulate. She understood the logic behind gradual integration and the importance of earning trust through demonstrated competence. But she also knew that her theoretical knowledge exceeded that of anyone else on the crew, and her computational speed was faster than the digital systems they used for backup calculations. Watching other soldiers struggle with ballistic problems she could solve in her head felt like watching children work through multiplication tables she had mastered in elementary school. The first hint of change came during a particularly challenging exercise in the fourth week of Maria's assignment. The target was positioned at maximum range, nearly 15 miles across terrain that included 3 different elevation changes and wind patterns that shifted hourly throughout the day. Previous crews had struggled with the target, achieving hits less than 60% of the time despite multiple attempts and extensive preparation. Thompson assigned the exercise to Stone's team with instructions to achieve at least 3 hits out of 5 attempts. The success rate would determine whether the crew was ready for advanced training scenarios that more closely approximated combat conditions. For Stone, the exercise represented an opportunity to demonstrate the crew's readiness for deployment. For Maria, it represented an opportunity to prove that her contributions extended beyond mathematical theory. The morning of the exercise dawned clear and cold, with winds that promised to increase throughout the day. Maria arrived an hour before the scheduled start time and began collecting meteorological data from instruments positioned around the range. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed, and direction at multiple elevations. Each variable contributed to the complex equation that would determine whether shells traveled true to their intended targets. As the rest of the crew prepared equipment and reviewed procedures, Maria worked through preliminary calculations using data she had collected over the previous 3 weeks. She had noticed patterns in the range's weather systems that didn't appear in the official meteorological reports, subtle variations that could account for the inconsistent accuracy rates other crews had experienced at maximum distance. When Thompson called for the first firing solution, Stone stepped forward with calculations that represented the crew's best collective judgment. The solution was mathematically sound, based on established procedures and current weather data. Maria listened to Stone's presentation and recognized immediately that it failed to account for the thermal updrafts created by the mountain ridges that surrounded the range. She waited until Stone finished his presentation, then raised her hand with the tentative gesture of someone who understood the delicate politics of military hierarchy. Thompson nodded for her to speak, and Maria presented her alternative calculation in terms that emphasized tactical considerations rather than mathematical theory. She explained how thermal patterns created by the surrounding mountains could affect shell trajectory at distances beyond 12 miles, and how adjusting for these patterns could improve accuracy by 15 to 20%. Stone listened to her explanation with the patience of someone who had heard dozens of theoretical suggestions from soldiers who had never fired a shot in combat. When Maria finished, he nodded politely and thanked her for the input, then proceeded with his own firing solution without modification. The shell landed 200 meters short and 50 meters left of the target, well within the margin of error for maximum range firing but far from the precision that would be required in combat situations. The second shot, using the same firing solution with minor adjustments for observed error, landed closer but still missed the target by significant margin. Thompson called for a consultation between Stone and the crew's other experienced gunners, leaving Maria to observe from a distance as they debated modifications to the original calculation. After 20 minutes of discussion, Stone announced a revised firing solution that incorporated some of Maria's suggestions about thermal effects, but maintained the basic mathematical framework he had established. The third shot landed within 50 meters of the target, close enough to be considered a hit under training standards, but not close enough to satisfy Stone's professional standards. As the crew prepared for the fourth attempt, Maria approached Thompson with a request that surprised everyone present. She asked for permission to provide a complete firing solution for the final 2 shots, using calculations that incorporated all the meteorological data she had collected over the previous weeks. Thompson looked at Stone, who shrugged with the resigned expression of someone who had nothing left to lose. Maria's firing solution differed from Stone's in several key respects. She adjusted for thermal updrafts that created convection patterns invisible to standard weather instruments. She accounted for the Coriolis effect at extreme distance, a factor that most gunners ignored at ranges under 20 miles. Most significantly, she incorporated historical wind pattern data to predict how atmospheric conditions would change during the shell's 45-second flight time. Stone listened to her presentation with growing attention, his initial skepticism giving way to professional curiosity as Maria explained calculations that went well beyond standard artillery doctrine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When she finished, he asked several technical questions that tested her understanding of advanced ballistic theory. Maria answered each question with the confident precision of someone who had spent years studying concepts that most soldiers learned through trial and error. The fourth shot, using Maria's complete firing solution, struck within 10 meters of the target center. The accuracy was remarkable enough to draw attention from other crews training on adjacent ranges. But what impressed Stone most was the mathematical elegance of Maria's approach. Her calculations didn't just account for current conditions. They predicted how those conditions would evolve during the time required for the shell to reach its target. For the fifth and final shot, Maria requested permission to make one additional modification to her firing solution. She had noticed that the previous shot had been affected by a wind shift that occurred approximately 30 seconds into the shell's flight. By adjusting the firing angle by less than 1 degree, she could compensate for the predicted wind change and achieve dead center accuracy. Stone studied her revised calculation for several minutes, checking her mathematics against his own understanding of ballistic theory. The adjustment was so minor that it fell within the normal margin of error for manual firing calculations, but Maria's reasoning was sound enough to warrant consideration. Thompson authorized the modification, and Stone input the new coordinates into the Howitzer's targeting system. The fifth shell screamed across 15 miles of desert landscape, its path as true as the mathematical principles that guided it. When it struck dead center of the target, the impact was visible even from the observation post positioned 2 miles from the firing line. Stone lowered his binoculars and turned to look at Maria with an expression she had never seen before. Respect, mixed with something that might have been surprise. Thompson recorded the results in his official report, noting that the crew had achieved 4 hits out of 5 attempts at maximum range, with the final shot demonstrating accuracy that exceeded training standards. He made no specific mention of Maria's contributions, but Stone approached her after the exercise with questions about thermal calculation methods and requests for copies of her meteorological data. That evening, Maria sat in her quarters reviewing the day's events and trying to process the subtle shift in how her crew members had looked at her after the final shot. The change wasn't dramatic. There were no congratulations or formal acknowledgments, but there was a difference in the quality of attention she received, as if people were seeing her clearly for the first time rather than looking through the filter of their own assumptions. She pulled out her grandfather's old artillery manual and found the page where he had written about the loneliness of precision. The thing about being accurate, he had written in faded ink, is that people notice when you miss, but they take it for granted when you hit. The job isn't to be celebrated, it's to be trusted. Maria had read those words hundreds of times, but tonight they carried new weight, the significance of experience rather than theory. Outside her window, the desert stretched toward mountains that would challenge tomorrow's training exercise. Maria opened her laptop and began downloading meteorological data for the coming day, analyzing patterns that would determine whether shells found their targets or fell harmlessly into empty sand. The work was solitary and demanding, requiring the kind of sustained attention that most people found exhausting. For Maria, it felt like coming home. The weeks that followed brought gradual changes that were more significant for their subtlety than their drama. Stone began consulting with Maria during the planning phase of exercises rather than reviewing her work after the fact. Thompson assigned her increasingly complex targeting scenarios that tested her ability to integrate multiple variables into coherent firing solutions. Most importantly, the crew began treating her suggestions as professional recommendations, rather than theoretical possibilities. The transformation wasn't complete. Maria still faced skepticism from soldiers outside her immediate unit, and her small stature continued to prompt protective instincts that she found more frustrating than flattering. But within the Howitzer crew, she had achieved something more valuable than acceptance. She had earned the kind of trust that came from demonstrated competence under pressure. Colonel Harrison remained distant and skeptical, occasionally observing training exercises from his command vehicle, but rarely offering direct feedback about crew performance. Maria suspected that he was waiting for her to fail in some spectacular fashion that would validate his initial doubts about her suitability for artillery service. The knowledge that she was being watched and evaluated added pressure to every exercise, but it also motivated her to maintain the highest possible standards in her work. As autumn progressed toward winter, Fort Meridian prepared for its annual live fire evaluation, an exercise that would test every artillery crew against scenarios designed to approximate combat conditions. The evaluation would determine deployment readiness and crew assignments for the coming year. For Maria, it represented an opportunity to prove that her contributions extended beyond theoretical knowledge to practical application under the most demanding circumstances. The evaluation would include targets at maximum range under adverse weather conditions, time-sensitive fire missions that demanded rapid response, and coordination exercises that tested the crew's ability to work together under pressure. Maria had spent months preparing for these challenges, but she knew that preparation could only accomplish so much. When the evaluation began, she would be measured not by her potential but by her performance, not by her knowledge but by her results. The night before the evaluation, Maria stood at her window watching storm clouds gather over the mountains that surrounded Fort Meridian. Tomorrow would bring wind and possibly precipitation, conditions that would challenge even experienced crews to maintain accuracy across long distances. She thought about her grandfather's notes on weather compensation and the techniques he had developed for firing in conditions that other gunners considered impossible. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, targets waited to test everything she had learned about precision and mathematics and trust. Maria had spent years preparing for this moment, but she knew that preparation was only the beginning. Tomorrow would determine whether she was an artillery specialist or just someone who understood artillery theory. The distinction would matter more than she could possibly imagine. The storm arrived 3 hours before dawn, bringing with it the kind of weather that separated theoretical knowledge from practical expertise. Maria woke to the sound of rain drumming against her window and wind that howled through the gaps between buildings like a living thing seeking entry. She checked her watch. 0347 hours. The live fire evaluation was scheduled to begin at 0800, which gave her just over 4 hours to prepare for conditions that would challenge every calculation she had ever made. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on layers that would provide warmth without restricting movement. The weather report she had reviewed the previous evening had predicted light precipitation and moderate winds, but the storm raging outside her window was far more severe than anything the meteorological service had anticipated. Maria grabbed her equipment bag and headed for the door, knowing that other crew members would be making similar adjustments to their morning routines. The artillery range was a different world in the storm. Wind-driven rain reduced visibility to less than 50 meters, and the normally firm ground had turned into a slick mixture of mud and standing water that made every step treacherous. Maria made her way carefully toward the meteorological station, where instruments measured conditions that would determine whether the evaluation proceeded as scheduled or was postponed until weather improved. She found Sergeant Thompson already at the station, studying readouts that painted a picture of challenging but not impossible conditions. Wind speeds were gusting to 35 miles per hour, with sustained winds of 22 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature had dropped 15 degrees since midnight, and barometric pressure was falling rapidly as the storm system moved through the area. Rain was intermittent but heavy, with periods of intensity that would affect visibility for both crews and forward observers. Thompson looked up as Maria approached, rain streaming from the brim of his campaign hat. His expression was grim but determined, the look of a soldier who had conducted training exercises in conditions far worse than anything nature could produce in New Mexico. He gestured toward the instrument readouts and spoke in the clipped tones of someone who needed to communicate essential information quickly and clearly. The evaluation would proceed as scheduled, with modifications to account for weather conditions. Maximum range targets would be reduced from 15 miles to 12 miles to compensate for wind effects on shell trajectory. Time limits for fire missions would be extended by 30% to allow for additional calculation time required by adverse conditions. Most significantly, accuracy standards would be adjusted to reflect the increased difficulty of achieving precision in high winds and limited visibility. Maria absorbed this information while mentally recalculating every firing solution she had prepared over the previous weeks. The reduced range would actually work in her favor, as it fell within the distance parameters where her understanding of local weather patterns was most precise. The extended time limits would allow her to incorporate more variables into her calculations without the pressure of rapid response that favored experienced gunners over mathematical precision. As dawn broke gray and turbulent over the mountains, other members of the Howitzer crew began arriving at the range. Stone appeared through the rain like a figure emerging from a painting, his uniform already soaked despite the rain gear that covered him from head to toe. Morrison and Chang arrived together, moving with the careful coordination of soldiers who had learned to function as a unit regardless of external conditions. The howitzer itself stood in its firing position like a monument to human engineering, its massive barrel elevated toward targets that remained invisible in the storm-swept distance. Despite the rain, the weapon's mechanical systems functioned flawlessly, protected by covers and maintenance procedures that had been refined through decades of military service. Maria ran her hands along the elevation controls, feeling the smooth precision of machinery that could place shells within meters of targets miles away. Colonel Harrison arrived in his command vehicle precisely at 0800, his presence announced by the crunch of tires on gravel and the slam of vehicle doors that carried clearly despite the wind. He emerged wearing the kind of rain gear that senior officers could afford, equipment that kept him dry while projecting an image of someone who remained comfortable regardless of circumstances. His aide followed with a waterproof case containing evaluation forms and communication equipment that would record every aspect of the day's exercises. The first target of the evaluation was positioned at 8 miles, a distance that normally presented no significant challenges for experienced crews. Under current weather conditions, however, the target might as well have been on another continent. Wind patterns at various altitudes would affect shell trajectory in ways that required constant recalculation, and limited visibility meant that forward observers would have difficulty providing accurate damage assessment. Thompson gathered the crew around a map table that had been covered with plastic sheeting to protect it from the rain. He outlined the day's scenarios using a pointer that left wet trails across the protective covering, his voice raised to carry over the wind but still maintaining the professional tone that characterized all his briefings. The evaluation would consist of 5 distinct exercises, each designed to test different aspects of artillery operation under adverse conditions. Stone stepped forward to present the firing solution for the first target, his calculations based on standard procedures modified to account for current weather conditions. Maria listened to his presentation while running parallel calculations in her head, noting several places where his approach differed from what she would have recommended. The differences weren't necessarily wrong, but they reflected a conservative approach that prioritized consistency over optimization. When Stone finished his presentation, Thompson asked if anyone had questions or suggestions. Maria raised her hand, then presented an alternative approach that incorporated real-time wind measurements from multiple elevations. She explained how thermal layers created by the storm system could create updrafts and downdrafts that would affect shell trajectory in ways that standard calculations didn't address. Stone studied her revised firing solution with the attention of someone who had learned to evaluate new information without letting ego interfere with judgment. After several minutes of review, he nodded and incorporated elements of Maria's approach into his own calculations. The compromise solution represented the best of both approaches. Stone's experience-based intuition, combined with Maria's mathematical precision. The first shell left the howitzer with a sound like thunder, its departure marked by a flash of flame that illuminated the rain-soaked landscape for a brief moment before disappearing into the gray morning sky. Maria tracked its flight path in her mind, following the mathematical curve that should carry it to the target 8 miles away. 42 seconds after firing, the radio crackled with confirmation from forward observers. Hit. Center mass. Target destroyed. The success of the first shot established a pattern that would continue throughout the morning. Maria's weather calculations proved increasingly accurate as the storm system moved through the area, and her ability to predict wind changes allowed the crew to maintain precision that other units struggled to achieve. By the third exercise, Thompson was consulting with her before each firing solution, treating her input as essential rather than supplementary. The fourth exercise presented the most challenging scenario of the evaluation. A time-sensitive fire mission that required accurate fire on a target at maximum range within 90 seconds of receiving coordinates. The scenario simulated close air support for troops in contact, where delays could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Under normal conditions, the exercise tested crew coordination and rapid response capabilities. In the current storm, it would test everything the crew had learned about functioning under pressure. Thompson received the target coordinates at exactly 1,047 hours and immediately began the countdown that would measure the crew's response time. Stone and Maria worked in parallel, each developing firing solutions using different mathematical approaches but arriving at coordinates that differed by less than 50 meters at the target end. The convergence of their calculations provided confidence that their solution was mathematically sound. But mathematical soundness meant nothing if the shell missed its target. Morrison loaded the projectile with movements that had been practiced thousands of times, his actions smooth and efficient, despite the rain that made every surface slick and treacherous. Chang adjusted elevation and azimuth according to the agreed-upon firing solution, her touch on the controls as delicate as a surgeon's, despite the heavy gloves required by the weather. Park maintained communication with forward observers, providing updates on wind conditions and visibility that could affect damage assessment. At exactly 87 seconds after receiving coordinates, the Howitzer fired its fourth shell of the evaluation. Maria watched the projectile disappear into the storm-darkened sky, following its invisible path through calculations that accounted for every variable she could measure or predict. The shell would travel for nearly a minute before reaching its target, enough time for weather conditions to change in ways that could affect the final outcome. 93 seconds after firing, the radio crackled with the response every crew member hoped to hear. Direct hit. Target eliminated. Outstanding accuracy under adverse conditions. The forward observer's voice carried a note of surprise that suggested the result exceeded expectations for firing under such challenging circumstances. Colonel Harrison's voice came over the command frequency moments later, requesting immediate consultation with the crew responsible for the exceptional accuracy. Thompson acknowledged the request and began gathering his equipment, but Harrison's next transmission made it clear that he wanted to speak specifically with the soldier responsible for the firing calculations that had produced such remarkable results. Maria felt every eye on the crew turn toward her as Thompson gestured for her to accompany him to the command vehicle. She had spent months preparing for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she felt unprepared for the attention it would bring. Harrison was known for his detailed questioning of subordinates, and his skepticism about her capabilities had been evident since her arrival at Fort Meridian. The command vehicle provided shelter from the rain, but not from the intensity of Harrison's scrutiny. He sat behind a field desk, covered with evaluation forms and communication equipment, his gray eyes studying Maria with the same detached assessment she had experienced during their first meeting. Thompson stood at attention beside her, ready to provide context for her performance during the morning's exercises. Harrison's questions were precise and technical, designed to test whether Maria's success was based on genuine understanding or fortunate guesswork. He asked her to explain the mathematical basis for her wind compensation calculations, to justify her approach to thermal layer analysis, and to defend her decision to incorporate non-standard variables into her firing solutions. Each question built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive examination of her theoretical knowledge and practical application. Maria answered each question with the confident precision that had characterized her work since arriving at Fort Meridian. She explained her methodology without defensiveness, acknowledged the limitations of her approach without undermining its effectiveness, and demonstrated mathematical competence that exceeded the requirements for her current position. Harrison listened without comment, occasionally making notes that revealed nothing about his assessment of her responses. When the questioning ended, Harrison dismissed Thompson, but asked Maria to remain for additional consultation. He pulled out a folder containing personnel files and evaluation reports, spreading documents across his desk with the methodical care of someone who made decisions based on comprehensive analysis, rather than intuitive judgment. Maria recognized her own service record among the papers, along with training reports and academic transcripts that painted a complete picture of her military career. Harrison's next question surprised her with its directness. "Specialist Santos, what do you consider to be the primary limitation of your current assignment?" Maria had expected continued technical questioning, not an invitation to critique her own utilization within the unit. She considered her response carefully, recognizing that her answer would reveal as much about her ambitions as her capabilities. She explained that her current role limited her contributions to mathematical support rather than comprehensive artillery operation. While she valued the opportunity to contribute to crew effectiveness, she believed her capabilities could be better utilized in positions that required integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application. She was careful to express appreciation for her current assignment while making clear her desire for increased responsibility. Harrison listened to her response without interruption, then asked a follow-up question that revealed the purpose behind his inquiry. "If I were to recommend you for advanced artillery training, what would you consider to be your greatest weakness?" The question was clearly a test, designed to assess her self-awareness and professional judgment under pressure. Maria thought about the question for several minutes before responding. Her greatest weakness wasn't technical knowledge or mathematical capability. It was the perception that her physical limitations made her unsuitable for certain aspects of artillery operation. She had proven her ability to perform calculations and operate targeting systems, but she had never been tested under the physical demands of combat conditions where crew members needed to function as interchangeable parts of a larger machine. Her honesty seemed to satisfy Harrison, who made additional notes before closing her personnel file. He explained that her performance during the evaluation had been exceptional, but exceptional performance under training conditions didn't necessarily translate to effectiveness under combat stress. He was considering recommending her for specialized training that would test her capabilities under more demanding circumstances. The conversation concluded with Harrison's instruction to continue performing at her current level while he completed his assessment of her suitability for advanced training. Maria understood that she was being evaluated not just for her current position but for potential roles that would require greater responsibility and autonomy. The knowledge was both encouraging and intimidating, representing opportunities she had hoped for since joining the Artillery Corps. The fifth and final exercise of the evaluation would take place after a lunch break that allowed crews to rest and prepare for the most challenging scenario of the day. The target would be positioned at the maximum allowable distance under current weather conditions, and crews would be required to achieve 3 hits out of 5 attempts within a compressed time frame that simulated rapid-fire support. Maria spent the break reviewing meteorological data and refining her calculations for long-range firing under deteriorating weather conditions. The storm was beginning to move out of the area, but its departure was creating wind patterns that were even more complex than the stable conditions that had prevailed during the morning exercises. She identified 3 distinct thermal layers that would affect shell trajectory, each requiring separate mathematical treatment to achieve accurate predictions. When the afternoon exercise began, Maria's crew was assigned to fire third in a sequence that would allow evaluation of comparative performance under identical conditions. She watched the first 2 crews struggle with the challenging conditions, achieving hit rates well below the standards they had demonstrated during previous training exercises. The difficulties faced by experienced crews highlighted the exceptional nature of conditions created by the departing storm system. Stone approached her as their turn approached, carrying firing solutions that represented his best estimate of optimal targeting parameters. He asked for her review of his calculations, a request that would have been unthinkable during her first weeks at Fort Meridian. Maria studied his work and identified several areas where alternative approaches might improve accuracy, but she was careful to present her suggestions as refinements rather than corrections. Their collaboration produced a firing solution that incorporated elements neither of them could have developed independently. Stone's experience-based intuition provided practical insights that pure mathematical analysis couldn't generate, while Maria's theoretical knowledge allowed optimization that experience alone couldn't achieve. The synthesis represented the kind of professional partnership that made crews more effective than the sum of their individual capabilities. The first shot of their sequence struck within 30 meters of the target center, close enough to be considered a hit under training standards, but not close enough to satisfy the crew's professional expectations. Maria analyzed the impact point and identified wind shear effects that her original calculations had underestimated. She quickly developed a compensation factor that should improve accuracy for subsequent shots. The second shot, incorporating Maria's wind shear compensation, struck within 10 meters of target center. The third shot hit dead center, producing the kind of precision that drew attention from other crews and evaluation personnel. The fourth shot repeated the dead center accuracy, demonstrating that the result wasn't accidental but reflected systematic understanding of the complex variables affecting long-range accuracy. For the fifth and final shot, Maria requested permission to make one additional adjustment to account for atmospheric changes caused by the departing storm system. Her proposed modification was so minor that it fell within normal margins of error, but her reasoning was mathematically sound enough to warrant consideration. Thompson authorized the adjustment, and Stone implemented the revised firing solution with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust Maria's mathematical precision. The final shell traveled 12 miles through air still turbulent from the departing storm, its path as true as the calculations that guided it through the complex atmospheric conditions. When it struck the exact center of the target, the impact was visible even through the residual haze left by the storm system. Maria had achieved 5 consecutive hits at maximum range under some of the most challenging conditions any crew had faced during evaluation exercises. The silence that followed the final shot was broken by Colonel Harrison's voice over the command frequency, requesting immediate consultation with the crew that had achieved perfect accuracy under impossible conditions. His tone carried a note of respect that Maria had never heard before, the acknowledgement of performance that exceeded expectations even for experienced personnel. As Maria gathered her equipment and prepared to report to the command vehicle, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been an untested specialist, whose theoretical knowledge meant nothing without practical demonstration. Today she had proven that mathematical precision could achieve results that experience alone couldn't match, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that her contributions extended beyond calculation to genuine artillery expertise. The rain had stopped by the time she reached Harrison's command vehicle, and patches of blue sky were beginning to appear through the dispersing clouds. The colonel waited with evaluation forms that would determine her future assignments and opportunities for advancement. Maria had spent years preparing for this evaluation, but she knew that preparation was only the beginning of a career that would be defined by her ability to perform under pressure. Harrison's assessment would determine whether she remained in her current support role or advanced to positions that required greater responsibility and autonomy. Maria had proven her technical competence beyond any reasonable doubt, but military effectiveness required qualities that couldn't be measured through mathematical precision alone. She was about to discover whether her performance during the evaluation had addressed the concerns that had shaped Harrison's initial skepticism about her capabilities. The afternoon sun broke through the departing clouds as Maria knocked on the door of the command vehicle, ready to learn whether her exceptional performance had earned her the recognition she had worked so hard to achieve. She had hit every target with mathematical precision, but the most important target remained: the respect of leaders who would determine whether her talents were utilized to their full potential or constrained by assumptions about what small women could accomplish in traditionally male-dominated fields. The conversation that followed would shape the trajectory of her military career and determine whether excellence was enough to overcome prejudice in an institution that valued tradition as much as innovation. Maria had proven she could hit targets at impossible distances under impossible conditions, but the target that mattered most was the one that existed in the minds of people who would decide her future. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn silence at Fort Meridian with the kind of urgency that turned trained soldiers into moving machinery within seconds of awakening. Maria bolted upright in her bunk as the alarm's mechanical wail echoed off the barracks walls, her mind instantly calculating the time: 04:34 hours. Real emergencies didn't wait for convenient timing, and the sound that dragged her from sleep carried the unmistakable tone of actual crisis rather than scheduled drill. She dressed in the darkness with movements that had been drilled into muscle memory, pulling on layers of gear that would protect her from desert cold and whatever dangers waited beyond the safety of the base perimeter. The emergency frequency crackled to life on her radio as she secured her equipment, carrying fragmentary reports that painted a picture of developing chaos somewhere in the vast expanse of territory that Fort Meridian was responsible for monitoring and protecting. A convoy of civilian contractors had missed their scheduled check-in while transporting critical supplies through the mountain passes 30 miles northeast of the base. Initial reconnaissance flights had located their position pinned down by hostile forces in terrain that made conventional rescue operations impossible. The civilians were trapped in a narrow canyon with limited cover, facing an enemy that held commanding positions on the surrounding ridges. Maria joined the stream of personnel moving toward the command center, where emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across faces that reflected the grim determination of soldiers who understood that other people's lives depended on their professional competence. Colonel Harrison stood at the center of organized chaos, directing the flow of information and resources with the calm efficiency that separated exceptional leaders from merely competent ones. The tactical situation was as challenging as any scenario Maria had studied during her training. The trapped convoy occupied a position at the bottom of a steep-walled canyon that provided excellent protection from direct fire but made extraction nearly impossible. Enemy forces held positions on both sides of the canyon, with clear fields of fire that would eliminate any rescue attempt using conventional ground forces. Air support was limited by weather conditions that had moved in overnight, creating low visibility and unpredictable wind patterns that made close air support missions extremely hazardous. The canyon's narrow configuration further complicated aerial operations, as attack helicopters would be forced to operate within range of enemy weapons, while maneuvering in confined spaces that left little room for error. The only viable option for neutralizing the enemy positions involved artillery fire from maximum range, using indirect fire to eliminate threats that couldn't be addressed through direct confrontation. However, the precision required for such an operation exceeded anything typically attempted under combat conditions. The margin for error was essentially zero, as shells that fell short would endanger the civilians, while shells that overshot their targets would have no effect on the tactical situation. Harrison called for consultation with his senior artillery specialists, summoning the officers and non-commissioned officers, whose expertise would determine whether the rescue mission was technically feasible. Maria found herself included in the group, a recognition of her demonstrated competence that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier but felt natural after her performance during the recent evaluation exercises. The briefing room filled with a subdued intensity of professionals who understood that their decisions would determine whether innocent people lived or died. Intelligence specialists presented overhead imagery that revealed the exact positions of enemy forces and the precise location of the trapped convoy. The images showed a tactical nightmare. Civilians clustered in inadequate cover, while enemy forces occupied positions that provided both protection and advantageous firing angles. Sergeant Stone studied the imagery with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read terrain features like text, identifying dead spaces and fields of fire that would influence any tactical solution. His analysis confirmed what everyone suspected. Conventional ground assault would be suicidal, and air support would be ineffective given current weather conditions and the confined nature of the battlefield. Colonel Harrison turned to the artillery specialists and posed the question that everyone had been avoiding. Could precision fire eliminate the enemy positions without endangering the civilians below? The targeting requirements were unlike anything attempted during peacetime training. Shells would need to strike specific positions on steep terrain from a distance of nearly 18 miles, achieving accuracy measured in meters rather than the hundreds of meters that constituted acceptable performance under normal circumstances. Stone presented a preliminary assessment that was technically honest but strategically discouraging. Standard artillery doctrine called for accuracy within 50 meters at maximum range under ideal conditions. Current weather patterns and the complex terrain surrounding the target area would significantly increase the margin of error, making precision strikes extremely unlikely using conventional firing solutions. Maria listened to Stone's assessment while running calculations in her head, incorporating variables that standard doctrine didn't address, but that her mathematical training had taught her to consider. The problem wasn't impossible. It was simply beyond the scope of solutions that most gunners would attempt. However, her understanding of advanced ballistics suggested approaches that might achieve the required precision if executed with perfect mathematical accuracy. When Stone finished his presentation, Harrison asked if anyone had alternative approaches that might improve the probability of success. Maria raised her hand with the hesitant gesture of someone who understood that her suggestion would commit her to responsibility for the outcome. She explained that unconventional firing solutions might achieve the required accuracy, but only if multiple variables were calculated with precision that exceeded normal artillery standards. Her approach involved using multiple howitzers, firing in carefully coordinated sequence, with each gun targeting a specific enemy position, using firing solutions that accounted for the unique ballistic characteristics of each weapon. The mathematical complexity was enormous, requiring real-time calculation of trajectories that incorporated atmospheric conditions, terrain effects, and weapon-specific variables that most gunners ignored. Harrison studied her preliminary calculations with the attention of someone who recognized both the elegance and the audacity of her proposal. The approach was theoretically sound, but it demanded mathematical precision and coordination that had never been attempted under combat conditions. A single error in calculation or timing would result in friendly fire casualties that would turn a rescue mission into a tragedy. The silence that followed Maria's presentation was broken by Stone's quiet observation that her approach represented the only realistic possibility for achieving the required accuracy. He had reviewed her mathematics and found them sound, despite their complexity. If the mission was to proceed, her unconventional methods offered the best chance of success, however remote that chance might be. Harrison made the decision that defined leadership under impossible circumstances. The mission would proceed using Maria's firing solutions, with her serving as primary fire control coordinator for the entire operation. The appointment carried authority that exceeded her rank, but authority was meaningless if the mission failed. She would be responsible for calculations that determined whether civilians lived or died, whether the rescue succeeded or became another tragedy that ended military careers and haunted consciences. The next 3 hours transformed Fort Meridian into a precisely orchestrated machine focused on a single objective. 3 separate Howitzer crews prepared their weapons according to specifications that Maria had calculated for each gun, accounting for barrel wear, ammunition variations, and mechanical tolerances that could affect accuracy at extreme range. Each crew received firing solutions that differed in subtle but crucial ways, tailored to the specific characteristics of their equipment. Maria established her command position at the Fire Direction Center, surrounded by computers and communication equipment that would allow her to coordinate the complex firing sequence she had designed. Multiple screens displayed real-time weather data, target imagery, and ballistic calculations that were updated continuously as conditions changed. The mathematical complexity was staggering, but Maria had spent years preparing for challenges that demanded everything theoretical knowledge could provide. Communication with the trapped convoy was intermittent, limited to brief radio contacts that revealed an increasingly desperate situation. Enemy forces were methodically advancing their positions, using cover and concealment to move closer to the civilians who had no means of escape. Time was becoming the most critical variable in calculations that already demanded impossible precision. The firing solution Maria had developed required perfect timing and flawless execution from all 3 Howitzer crews. The first gun would target the primary enemy position on the northern ridge, using a trajectory that would clear the canyon walls by less than 50 meters. The second gun would engage targets on the southern ridge, firing 30 seconds after the first shot to account for enemy reaction time. The third gun would provide suppressive fire that would prevent enemy forces from repositioning after the initial strikes. Each shot represented a calculation that incorporated hundreds of variables, from atmospheric pressure variations to the rotational effects that influenced shell trajectory over long distances. Maria had double-checked every computation, but mathematics could only account for measurable factors. Success would ultimately depend on variables that couldn't be calculated. The accuracy of intelligence reports, the reliability of equipment under stress, and the execution capabilities of crews who had never attempted anything approaching this level of precision. Colonel Harrison established himself at the command center where he could monitor the operation without interfering with technical decisions that required specialized knowledge. His presence served as a reminder that the mission's outcome would be evaluated at levels far above Fort Meridian, but it also demonstrated confidence in Maria's capabilities that validated months of proving herself under less critical circumstances. The atmospheric conditions that had initially complicated the firing solutions began to stabilize as the morning progressed, providing Maria with the consistent data she needed to refine her calculations. Wind patterns at various altitudes showed predictable variations that could be incorporated into trajectory analysis, and temperature stabilization reduced the thermal effects that influenced shell flight characteristics. At exactly 0847 hours, Maria received clearance to commence firing from the on-scene commander, who had established visual contact with both the trapped civilians and the enemy positions that threatened them. The authorization carried the weight of lives that depended on mathematical precision, professional competence, and equipment that had never been tested under such demanding circumstances. Maria's voice carried across the Fire Direction Center as she initiated the firing sequence that would determine the mission's outcome. Her commands were precise and calm, reflecting preparation that had anticipated every aspect of the complex operation. The first Howitzer crew acknowledged their firing solution and prepared to engage targets that existed as mathematical abstractions until shells transformed calculations into physical reality. The first shell departed Fort Meridian at 0849 hours and 17 seconds, beginning a flight that would carry it 18 miles through atmospheric conditions that could deflect it hundreds of meters from its intended target. Maria tracked its progress through calculations that predicted its path with theoretical precision, but theory meant nothing until the shell reached its destination and proved or disproved the mathematical principles that guided it. 47 seconds after firing, the radio crackled with confirmation from forward observers, who had maintained visual contact with the target area despite the dangerous proximity to enemy forces. The shell had struck within 5 meters of the designated target, close enough to neutralize the enemy position, without endangering the civilians below. The precision exceeded anything achieved during training exercises, validating mathematical approaches that most gunners would have considered impossible. The second shot followed 30 seconds later, targeting enemy positions on the opposite side of the canyon with calculations that differed from the first solution in dozens of subtle ways. Maria had accounted for the changed atmospheric conditions caused by the first explosion, the altered tactical situation that might affect enemy behavior, and the mechanical differences between howitzers that required unique mathematical treatment. The second shell's impact confirmed that Maria's mathematical precision could be replicated rather than attributed to fortunate accident. Enemy positions that had commanded the canyon floor were eliminated with surgical accuracy that left the trapped civilians unharmed, but removed the immediate threats that had prevented their extraction. The third gun fired its suppressive mission, according to a timetable that Maria had calculated to prevent enemy forces from repositioning after the precision strikes. The mathematical elegance of her approach became evident as the coordinated fire neutralized resistance, with minimal ammunition expenditure and maximum tactical effect. Enemy forces that survived the initial strikes found themselves unable to maintain effective positions, allowing rescue forces to approach the canyon without facing concentrated resistance. Colonel Harrison's voice came over the command frequency with the kind of measured approval that characterized his response to exceptional performance under pressure. The rescue mission had succeeded, because Maria's mathematical precision had achieved results that conventional artillery doctrine would have considered impossible. Civilian lives had been saved through the application of theoretical knowledge that most military personnel never encountered outside of advanced training courses. The extraction of the trapped convoy proceeded without significant resistance, as enemy forces had been either eliminated or forced to withdraw from positions that no longer provided tactical advantage. The civilians who had faced death in a remote canyon were airlifted to safety, their survival a testament to the precision that transformed mathematical theory into life-saving capability. Maria remained at her position in the fire direction center until the last civilian had been confirmed safe and the rescue forces had withdrawn from the operational area. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the magnitude of what had been accomplished, through calculations that pushed artillery precision beyond previously accepted limits. She had proven that mathematical excellence could achieve tactical results that experience alone couldn't match. The silence that followed the mission's completion was different from the tense quiet that had preceded it. Maria sat surrounded by computers and communication equipment that had enabled precision impossible without technological support. But the critical factor had been human intelligence applied to problems that required solutions beyond conventional approaches. Stone approached her position with the expression of someone who had witnessed performance that redefined his understanding of artillery capabilities. He offered no dramatic congratulations, just the quiet acknowledgement of professional respect earned through demonstrated competence under the most demanding circumstances. His nod carried the weight of recognition that Maria had achieved something that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis was forgotten. The debriefing that followed the mission focused on technical aspects of the firing solutions Maria had developed, with intelligence specialists and artillery experts seeking to understand how mathematical precision had achieved results that exceeded conventional expectations. Her explanations were detailed and precise, providing documentation that would allow future operations to benefit from techniques she had pioneered under combat conditions. Colonel Harrison's questions during the debriefing revealed his recognition that Maria's capabilities extended far beyond the support role she had originally been assigned. Her mathematical precision had solved a tactical problem that conventional approaches couldn't address, but more importantly, she had demonstrated leadership under pressure that earned her consideration for responsibilities that matched her demonstrated abilities. The formal evaluation that followed the debriefing documented performance that exceeded every measurable standard for artillery precision and fire coordination. Maria's achievement wasn't simply technical, it was strategic, proving that unconventional approaches could produce tactical advantages that traditional methods couldn't achieve. Her success had implications that extended beyond Fort Meridian to artillery doctrine throughout the military. As evening settled over the desert landscape that surrounded Fort Meridian, Maria stood at the window of her quarters, looking toward the mountains where her calculations had saved lives that morning. The mathematical principles she had applied were unchanged, but their significance had been transformed through application under circumstances that proved their practical value beyond theoretical interest. She opened her grandfather's old artillery manual and found the page where he had written about the responsibility that came with precision. The hardest part, he had noted in faded ink, isn't making the shot. It's living with the knowledge that other people's lives depend on your mathematics being perfect. Maria had read those words countless times, but tonight they carried the weight of experience rather than theory. The emergency that had tested her capabilities was over, but its resolution had created new challenges that would define her future military career. Maria had proven that her mathematical precision could achieve tactical results under combat conditions, but success brought responsibilities that would test qualities beyond technical competence. She had demonstrated that she belonged in roles that demanded excellence, but belonging was only the beginning of a career that would be defined by her ability to maintain impossible standards under increasing pressure. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as the final slide disappeared from the presentation screen, leaving only the soft hum of ventilation systems and the weight of decisions that would reshape artillery doctrine across the entire United States military. Maria sat at the polished conference table surrounded by generals whose combined combat experience spanned 5 decades and 3 continents, yet every eye in the room focused on the small woman whose mathematical precision had redefined what was possible in modern warfare. General Patricia Webb, Director of Artillery Development, broke the silence with a question that carried implications far beyond its simple phrasing. Specialist Santos, in your professional opinion, can these techniques be taught to standard artillery personnel, or do they require mathematical capabilities that exceed normal training parameters? The question addressed the fundamental challenge of transforming individual excellence into systematic improvement that could benefit the entire military. Maria considered her response carefully, understanding that her answer would influence training programs and operational procedures for thousands of artillery specialists across multiple branches of service. The mathematical concepts underlying her approach weren't impossibly complex, but they required a level of precision and attention to detail that many soldiers would find challenging to maintain under combat stress. She explained that the core principles could be taught to motivated personnel with adequate mathematical preparation, but successful implementation would require significant changes to existing training protocols and equipment standards. Her techniques demanded real-time calculation capabilities that exceeded what most artillery crews currently possessed, along with meteorological instrumentation that could provide the precise atmospheric data her firing solutions required. The discussion that followed revealed the broader implications of Maria's innovations for military operations in an era where precision increasingly determined tactical success. Her approach to artillery fire control represented a paradigm shift from volume-based suppression to surgical strikes that minimized collateral damage while maximizing tactical effectiveness. The strategic advantages were obvious, but implementation would require institutional changes that challenged traditional approaches to artillery training and deployment. Colonel Harrison, who had accompanied Maria to Washington, provided context for her achievements that the Pentagon officials needed to understand the full significance of her contributions. He described the impossible circumstances under which she had achieved her breakthrough results, emphasizing that her success wasn't theoretical, but had been proven under combat conditions that tested every aspect of military competence. The meeting concluded with General Webb's announcement that Maria would be assigned to a newly created position within the Artillery Development Division, where she would lead efforts to incorporate her mathematical innovations into standard training curricula and operational procedures. The assignment represented recognition that transcended normal promotional pathways, placing her in a role typically reserved for officers with advanced degrees and extensive command experience. 3 weeks later, Maria found herself standing before a classroom filled with artillery specialists from across the military, tasked with explaining mathematical concepts that had taken her years to master. The students ranged from recent graduates of artillery school to seasoned non-commissioned officers, whose experience with conventional fire control methods had to be supplemented with theoretical knowledge they had never needed before. Teaching proved to be a different kind of challenge from calculating firing solutions under combat pressure. Maria had to translate mathematical concepts into language that made sense to soldiers whose primary concern was practical application rather than theoretical understanding. She developed training exercises that demonstrated the tactical advantages of precision, without overwhelming students with mathematical complexity they didn't need to understand completely. The first group of students to complete Maria's advanced training program achieved accuracy improvements that validated her teaching methods and confirmed the broader applicability of her techniques. Their success led to expansion of the program and requests from international allies who wanted to incorporate similar precision capabilities into their own artillery operations. As her reputation grew within military circles, Maria received opportunities that would have seemed impossible during her early days at Fort Meridian. She was invited to speak at conferences where her presentations influenced artillery doctrine development in multiple countries. Defense contractors sought her consultation on weapon systems designed to take advantage of mathematical precision that her techniques made possible. Despite the recognition and expanding responsibilities, Maria never forgot the lessons learned during those early months when her competence was questioned and her contributions were dismissed. She made special efforts to identify and mentor other soldiers whose capabilities might be overlooked because they didn't fit traditional expectations for military excellence. One such soldier was Private First Class Jennifer Kim, a soft-spoken computer programmer who had enlisted seeking technical challenges but found herself assigned to conventional infantry roles that didn't utilize her analytical capabilities. Maria recognized Kim's potential during a training exercise where the younger woman's intuitive understanding of ballistic computation suggested mathematical aptitude that hadn't been properly developed. Under Maria's guidance, Kim learned to apply programming skills to artillery problems that required computational approaches beyond what standard training provided. Her success demonstrated that mathematical precision in artillery wasn't limited to individuals with Maria's specific background, but could be developed in anyone with appropriate aptitude and training. The mentoring relationship with Kim reminded Maria of conversations with her grandfather, whose patient explanations had first introduced her to the mathematical beauty underlying artillery science. She began incorporating those same teaching methods into her official training programs, emphasizing the elegant simplicity that made complex calculations manageable even under combat stress. As months passed, Maria's innovations became standard components of artillery training throughout the military. Her mathematical approaches were integrated into computerized fire control systems that automated many of the calculations she had originally performed manually. The technology enhanced human capabilities rather than replacing them, requiring soldiers who understood the principles underlying the automated solutions. The success of Maria's training programs led to her promotion to warrant officer, a recognition that acknowledged her technical expertise while providing the authority necessary to implement institutional changes. The promotion ceremony was attended by many of the soldiers who had initially questioned her capabilities, including Sergeant Stone, whose respect for her achievements had evolved into genuine admiration for her contributions to artillery effectiveness. Colonel Harrison, now promoted to Brigadier General, spoke at the ceremony about the transformation he had witnessed in both Maria's role and the artillery community's understanding of precision warfare. He acknowledged that his initial skepticism about her capabilities had been based on assumptions that experience had proven completely wrong. Maria's success had taught him that excellence often emerged from unexpected sources, and that effective leadership required recognizing potential regardless of how it was packaged. The ceremony concluded with Maria's first official act as a warrant officer, the presentation of graduation certificates to her latest class of advanced artillery specialists. Among the graduates was Jennifer Kim, now a sergeant whose programming skills had been instrumental in developing computerized applications of Maria's mathematical techniques. As Maria watched the graduation ceremony, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from questioning looks at Fort Meridian to recognition as a leader in artillery innovation. The path had required persistence through skepticism and the courage to maintain standards that others considered impossible to achieve. More importantly, it had taught her that technical excellence meant nothing without the ability to share knowledge in ways that enabled others to achieve similar success. The evening after the ceremony, Maria returned to her office to find a package that had arrived without a return address. Inside was a faded photograph showing a young artillery specialist standing beside a Howitzer in what appeared to be a Korean War-era military camp. On the back, someone had written in familiar handwriting, "Precision is a gift that keeps giving when shared with others who understand its value." She recognized her grandfather's handwriting, though she couldn't explain how the photograph had reached her office decades after his death. Perhaps her grandmother had arranged for its delivery, or maybe one of her grandfather's old military colleagues had preserved it until the right moment for presentation. The origin mattered less than the message, which reminded her that her achievements built upon foundations established by previous generations of soldiers who had understood the importance of mathematical precision in artillery operations. Maria placed the photograph on her desk beside her computer, where it would serve as a daily reminder of the heritage she represented and the responsibility she carried to continue advancing artillery science for future generations. The image showed equipment that was primitive compared to modern howitzers, but the mathematical principles underlying accurate fire, remained unchanged across decades of technological development. The following months brought new challenges as Maria's responsibilities expanded to include liaison work with research institutions developing next-generation artillery systems. Her mathematical expertise proved valuable in evaluating proposed technologies and identifying innovations that could enhance precision capabilities without compromising the reliability that artillery operations demanded. One particularly promising development involved integration of artificial intelligence systems that could perform real-time ballistic calculations using environmental data collected by autonomous sensors deployed throughout operational areas. The technology promised to extend Maria's mathematical approaches to situations where human calculation might be impossible due to time constraints or the complexity of rapidly changing conditions. Maria's role in evaluating and refining these systems brought her into contact with civilian scientists whose theoretical knowledge complemented her practical experience with artillery operations. The collaboration produced innovations that neither military personnel nor academic researchers could have developed independently, demonstrating the value of interdisciplinary approaches to complex technical challenges. As her career progressed, Maria found herself increasingly involved in strategic planning for artillery operations that utilized precision capabilities she had pioneered. Her input influenced decisions about force structure and equipment procurement that would affect military capabilities for decades. The responsibility was both humbling and motivating, confirming that individual excellence could indeed produce institutional change when supported by leaders who recognized its value. The culmination of Maria's impact on artillery doctrine came during a multinational exercise, where forces from 12 countries demonstrated coordinated precision fire capabilities based on techniques she had developed. The exercise simulated complex scenarios that required mathematical precision beyond what conventional artillery methods could achieve, proving that her innovations had practical applications across diverse military contexts. Watching the exercise from the observation center, Maria saw artillery crews from different countries working together with a level of precision that would have been impossible before her mathematical innovations became standard training components. Young soldiers who had learned her techniques as fundamental parts of their artillery education achieved accuracy that veterans with decades of experience had once considered impossible. General Webb, who had overseen the institutional changes that incorporated Maria's innovations into standard military practice, joined her at the observation center to watch the final phase of the exercise. The general's presence acknowledged Maria's role in developing capabilities that had transformed artillery from an area weapon system into a precision instrument capable of surgical strikes under the most demanding conditions. The exercise concluded with a demonstration that would have seemed like science fiction when Maria first arrived at Fort Meridian, a coordinated precision strike involving artillery units from 8 different countries, each firing at targets 15 miles away with accuracy measured in single-digit meters. The mathematical complexity of coordinating such an operation was staggering, but computerized systems based on Maria's theoretical work made it routine rather than miraculous. As applause echoed through the observation center, Maria thought about the path that had led from skeptical looks in the Fort Meridian mess hall to international recognition as a leader in artillery innovation. The journey had required persistence through doubt and the courage to maintain impossible standards when others suggested that merely adequate performance was sufficient. More importantly, it had taught her that individual excellence meant nothing unless it could be shared with others who would carry innovations forward to achieve even greater successes. Her mathematical precision had saved lives during that emergency rescue operation. But her teaching had multiplied that impact thousands of times over by enabling other soldiers to achieve similar precision under their own challenging circumstances. Years later, when Maria retired from active duty to accept a position developing artillery training programs for an international defense consortium, her farewell ceremony was attended by hundreds of soldiers whose careers had been influenced by her innovations. Among them was Jennifer Kim, now a major whose programming expertise had led to the development of artillery control systems used by militaries worldwide. The ceremony featured presentations from military leaders who described how Maria's mathematical precision had transformed artillery operations from approximate area suppression to surgical tactical applications. Her techniques had become so fundamental to modern artillery doctrine that many soldiers learned them without realizing they were studying innovations developed by a small woman who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for artillery service. Colonel Stone, now nearing his own retirement, spoke about the transformation he had witnessed in both artillery capabilities and institutional attitudes towards soldiers who brought unconventional backgrounds to traditional military roles. He acknowledged that his initial skepticism about Maria's potential had taught him valuable lessons about recognizing excellence, regardless of how it was packaged. The ceremony concluded with Maria's presentation of the first annual Santos Award for Innovation in Artillery Science, recognizing young soldiers whose mathematical or technical contributions showed promise for advancing artillery capabilities. The recipient was a recent graduate of artillery school whose undergraduate degree in atmospheric physics had enabled her to develop improved weather compensation techniques for extreme range firing. As Maria watched the award presentation, she reflected on the cyclical nature of military innovation and the importance of recognizing potential in unexpected places. Her own success had been possible because leaders like General Webb and eventually Colonel Harrison had been willing to look beyond conventional expectations to evaluate actual capabilities. The award recipient reminded Maria of herself decades earlier, a young woman whose technical background didn't fit traditional artillery profiles, but whose mathematical precision could contribute to tactical effectiveness in ways that experience alone couldn't achieve. The similarity was encouraging, suggesting that the institutional changes Maria had helped implement would continue identifying and developing unconventional talent. During her final week of active duty, Maria visited Fort Meridian one last time to address the current artillery training class. Standing before young soldiers who would learn her techniques as fundamental components of their military education, she emphasized that precision was more than mathematical accuracy. It was a commitment to excellence that required constant attention to details that others might consider insignificant. She told them about her grandfather's teaching that every shot was a conversation between physics and instinct, between mathematical certainty and human judgment. The balance between these elements was what transformed good artillery specialists into exceptional ones. But achieving that balance required dedication to standards that went beyond what was merely acceptable. The students listened with the attention of soldiers who understood that they were learning from someone whose innovations had shaped their entire field. Their questions revealed curiosity about mathematical concepts that previous generations of artillery personnel had never needed to understand, confirming that Maria's influence had fundamentally changed expectations for artillery education. As Maria left Fort Meridian for the final time, she drove past the artillery range where she had first proven her mathematical precision under combat conditions. The facility had been upgraded with new equipment that incorporated technologies developed through her research. But the fundamental challenge remained unchanged, placing shells exactly where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, regardless of conditions that made precision seem impossible. The desert landscape that surrounded the base was the same wasteland she had studied through mathematical calculations years earlier, but her understanding of its significance had been transformed through experience with real-world applications of theoretical knowledge. The mathematics hadn't changed, but their meaning had been enriched through recognition that precision could determine whether people lived or died. In her new civilian position, Maria continued developing artillery training programs that would prepare future soldiers to achieve precision that her generation had pioneered. Her work focused on identifying mathematical and technical aptitudes that could be developed into tactical capabilities, ensuring that the military would continue recognizing potential, regardless of how unconventionally it might be packaged. The impact of Maria's innovations extended far beyond military applications, influencing civilian technologies that required similar precision under challenging conditions. Her mathematical approaches found applications in aerospace engineering, where rocket guidance systems needed accuracy comparable to what she had achieved with artillery. Construction projects used her weather compensation techniques to improve accuracy in situations where environmental factors affected precision equipment. As her reputation grew in civilian circles, Maria received opportunities to speak at universities, where her presentations influenced engineering curricula and research priorities. Students who had never considered military applications discovered that precision warfare had developed mathematical techniques applicable to their own fields of study. The speaking engagements reminded Maria of conversations with her grandfather about the universal nature of mathematical principles and their applications across diverse technical challenges. Her artillery innovations had been successful because they applied fundamental concepts that weren't limited to military contexts, but represented general approaches to achieving precision under demanding conditions. Years after her retirement from military service, Maria received a letter from the current commander of Fort Meridian, describing a training exercise where artillery crews had achieved perfect accuracy at maximum range, under conditions that would have made precision impossible using conventional techniques. The success had been achieved by soldiers who had learned her methods as standard components of their artillery education, confirming that her innovations had become institutional capabilities rather than individual achievements. The letter included a photograph showing the newest class of artillery graduates, among whom was a young woman whose small stature and technical background reminded the commander of Maria's early days at Fort Meridian. The comparison was encouraging, suggesting that the institutional changes Maria had helped implement continued identifying and developing unconventional talent that might otherwise be overlooked. Maria kept the photograph on her desk as a reminder that precision was indeed a gift that kept giving when shared with others who understood its value. Her mathematical innovations had saved lives during that emergency rescue operation decades earlier, but her teaching had multiplied that impact by enabling countless other soldiers to achieve similar precision under their own challenging circumstances. The legacy she had created extended beyond technical innovations to include cultural changes that ensured the military would continue recognizing excellence regardless of how it might be packaged. Young women who brought mathematical or technical backgrounds to artillery service would find opportunities that previous generations had been denied, not because standards had been lowered, but because institutional understanding of excellence had been expanded. As Maria looked back on her career, she realized that her greatest achievement hadn't been the mathematical precision that enabled impossible accuracy under combat conditions. It had been the demonstration that individual excellence could produce institutional change when supported by leaders who were willing to evaluate capabilities rather than assumptions. Her success had opened doors for others whose potential might have been overlooked, creating opportunities that would benefit military effectiveness for generations to come. The mathematical principles underlying artillery precision remained unchanged, but their applications continued evolving as new technologies enabled even greater accuracy under increasingly challenging conditions. Maria's innovations had established foundations that would support continued advancement, ensuring that artillery would remain an effective tactical tool as warfare itself continued evolving. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.